As wildfires surge across the country, Canadians are seeing the very real cost climate change is already imposing. There's the cost of putting out the fires as firefighters from across the country and around the world work to control the flames. The cost of keeping people safe as towns are evacuated and families seek temporary shelter in neighboring regions. And the cost of rebuilding homes and communities ravaged by the flames. Even added healthcare costs as cities and towns are choked by thick smoke. Costs are expected to climb as climate-related disasters become more common. According to the Canadian Climate Institute, by 2025, climate change is expected to shave $25 billion off of Canada's GDP. And to break down all of those mounting costs of climate change, we're joined in studio by Dave Sawyer, Principal Economist at the Canadian Climate Institute. Dave, thanks for coming in.
Thank you, David, for having me.
Let's start with that $25 billion number. Is that just overall economic hit, or does that include the cost of disasters like we're seeing this year?
It includes some disaster costs. So to estimate that number, we identified 15 major areas that climate change is dragging down the economy. We sort of did a bunch of bottom-up analysis looking at impacts to roads, impacts to houses, impacts to productivity on business. And we put in a macroeconomic model, spun it out into the future, and came up with that estimate. What's not in there are a lot of intangible costs, like the healthcare costs that are associated with your son's asthma, for example.
Right. So how do we reconcile what's happening here, right? These numbers are enormous.
Yeah.
You look at these disasters that you're seeing, the subdivisions burning down or the houses in Halifax and in Nova Scotia. There's also a broader economic cost. How does this spill out just beyond the disasters?
Yeah, so supply chains are a big thing. So business disruption was one of the large hits that we have. So businesses have to shut down. So the wildfires in Fort McMurray a number of years ago resulted in about 25% of oil capacity shut down in the province. Floods result in small businesses being shut down for days. So that increases costs, that flows through the economy. So that's one of the ways. And my colleague calls it the pinball effect.
Right.
So somebody experiences a cost and it sort of bangs its way through the economy and increases prices.
Right, we even saw flights canceled today, right?
Flights.
In Philly and in LaGuardia in New York.
Yeah.
And so that has a knock-on effect to just basic business efficiency and out-of-pocket costs as people are stuck and delayed.
Yeah, people can't work, so lost income for households. So you're stuck for a bunch of days. You can't work in construction. You can't work outside because of increased heat.
You make the point in your analysis that this is what the knock-on effects of this is not progressive. It hits the lowest incomes hardest, and the people who can walk me through that. How does that manifest itself?
Well, a larger share of their income is in housing and transportation, and houses and buildings, road transportation get hit the hardest. And so a larger share of their income is impacted, and that then has a regressive impact basically on them. They also can't adapt. So there's not the capital there to invest in sort of measures to reduce exposure. HEPA filters, for example, right now. Even N95 masks, perhaps they can't afford. So, the most vulnerable are hit pretty hard.
When you look at the political debate, right? We've had the budget is going through right now. The Conservatives are attempting to hold it up or delay it, or at least look like they are, because they argue that there's costs in there, a carbon price increase that comes in on July 1st, a clean fuel regulation that comes in on July 1st, that are going to make life unaffordable. How do you square those arguments with the cost of what we're seeing for these climate-fueled disasters? Well,
the carbon tax is the only tax in the country we get back. This is what I don't understand. So we pay at the pump. We're holding the nozzle in our hand, and the gas is a little more expensive, and then we get a check later on to offset it. And we've crunched the numbers, and most folks are better off. They're very rich aren't. A lot of houses, a lot of cars, so they pay more. But most of us get back more or the same of what we pay.
But people see that, right? They see the price at the pump, and there's a delay in when they get the rebate. So they see the immediacy of the extra cost. How do you make the connection for people between the frustration of an expensive tank of gas and what we're seeing in Nova Scotia, what we're seeing in Quebec, and air quality in New York?
Well, it's balancing out. I think until we really started to get hit hard by extreme events, climate-related disasters, floods, hail, fires now. People really, it was sort of, a problem down the road. It was someone else, another generation's problem, someone else's problem, coastal, sea level rise. It's hitting home now. So I think it's changing views. I mean, that's, it makes sense.
Down the road is here, though, right? I mean, the intensity of this wildfire season, it looks like we're on track to, it's certainly the worst start in history. We're on track to probably have the worst season in history. Be surprised at this year and how quickly this has all happened.
How quickly it happened. So we have good data going back to the 70s on the number of these extreme events, including wildfires, floods, storms, ice storms, and the numbers have gone through the roof in the last decade. So we're having billion-dollar events every year now at the very least. We used to get those one every 10 years. We're getting many more events on an annual basis, and they're broadly distributed across the country. And so, yeah, it's hit us hard and fast.
Yeah, I mean, we just in the last 10 years, Fort McMurray,
Right.
Lytton burned to the ground in British Columbia.
Gone.
Luckily, that it wasn't quite as catastrophic in the suburbs of Halifax. I mean, how pessimistic are you at this point in time? Because, Bill Blair was here the other day saying they're forecasting the next 6 weeks, they're going to be awful.
Yeah, so adaptation. So we have to invest heavily in prevention. I mean, we really focus on mitigation, which is good. So how do we solve this problem? We reduce emissions globally, collectively, not in Canada, but like every ton matters globally. And then we adapt at home. We spend money on adaptation, and we've been slow to that game. The federal government, and the provinces have been slow. They're picking up their game, but they really need to make those serious investments and do the serious thinking around how to reduce the impacts.
How do you harness the political and the public will for that, right? There's a debate happening in the House of Commons about the deficit and spending and it driving inflation, and again, a disagreement over climate policy and how quickly to phase out oil and gas between the different parties. The political consensus isn't there, even if scientific consensus is.
Yeah.
So how do you marshal the support for big spending on mitigation and prevention measures?
Well, public opinion. I mean, these events are hitting home, aren't they? So there's going to be more space, I think, for people to sort of accept policy and accept governments doing things. Political consensus is, beyond my, I'm an economist.
Right, no, I gotcha. But it's interesting, we were talking during the commercial break when you were coming in about how we think of wildfires as a summer event, but it's the winter storms and the ice storms and the wind storms that knock off branches and knock off brush that create that canopy of fuel that's on the forest floor, right? I mean, so what can we do on that in terms of like forest grooming and cleaning things up? How do we approach these things?
Yeah, so better forest management practices, yeah, absolutely, and more money spent on fire breaks and forest management. Just like your previous guest, with more money spent on firefighting,
right.
We have to look at a broader suite of actions. Yeah.
But you've done the modeling on this too, right? That for every dollar spent on prevention, it's like a $14 or $15 multiplier. Explain to me how the economics of that, because we'll get you off public opinion, get back to
where I live. We were surprised at that number. So for every dollar we spend, you have direct impact. So in your house, so if you spend $1 on prevention to reduce a flood, you're going to save $5, give or take. And then what happens is that the pinball effects or the knock-on effects, especially business disruptions, then manifest or multiply through the economy. And that's how that number gets there. So supply chains get basically, costs get passed through and this sort of thing. So when you can avoid those costs, you can then avoid these pinball effects through the economy and reduce the damages. So prevention pays, basically, and in a big way. It's
an interesting thing, right? Because when governments invest in a business, they do the multiplier jobs, and everyone just kind of accepts that.
And they roll their eyes.
Right.
Some people.
But when you invest in, say, prevention and mitigation and do the multiplier effect on that, it seems to be a harder sell. Like it's a more difficult thing for people to imagine, even in times like this.
Well, we manage for acute problems. Look at healthcare. We put money into hospitals. We put way less money into prevention. Like avoid the acute outcome if you can. And I think governments are sort of slow to invest in prevention, loath to invest in prevention.
If the math is such a no-brainer, why do you think that is? I mean, if every dollar saves you 15 and here's the cost, I mean, I think the math works out to about half of all growth will be wiped out by climate disasters by the mid part of this century. If the math is such a no-brainer, why isn't it being listened to?
Yeah, so one of the challenges we've been so focused on mitigation and the costs of reducing emissions, the carbon tax, for example, and not enough attention paid to the climate impacts, the climate change impacts. So that's been the challenge, and we're just starting to get a handle on that and reveal those numbers. And then as we get comfortable with them and we see these disasters, the BC floods, for example, I think opinions and political consensus will maybe shift a little.